She was a devoted mother, doing everything she could to build a better life for her little girl. A woman who had seen her share of struggles but never backed down. She worked hard, kept to herself, and trusted that the walls of her home would keep her and her daughter safe. But what if the greatest danger wasn't outside those walls, but waiting just beyond her door? At Willow Pines Apartments, residents thought they knew the man who kept the place running. A friendly face. A helpful hand. A man whose job was to maintain the building, fix what was broken. But beneath that trusted exterior lurked something far more sinister. Because when rejection turned into obsession, and obsession spiraled into fury, those very walls that were meant to protect would become a prison. And by the time the screams were heard, by the time someone finally called for help, it was already too late. How does an ordinary night turn into an unspeakable nightmare? How does a mother's fight for a better life become a fight for survival? And what happens when a man, desperate to control what was never his, decides that if he can't have her, no one can? Before we unravel the horrifying truth of that night, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because this is one case you won't want to miss. Syntoria Caldwell was no stranger to struggle. At just 32 years old, she had already endured more than most: an abusive relationship, financial hardships, and the constant battle of being a single mother in a world that often seemed determined to break her. But no matter how hard things got, she never let it show. Because for Syntoria, there was one thing in this world that mattered more than anything else: her daughter, Racheal. 8-year-old Racheal Caldwell was the kind of child who could light up a room with just a smile. Sweet, intelligent, full of life, she was the type of little girl who made people believe in innocence and goodness. She loved reading, filling her notebooks with drawings of imaginary worlds, and curling up with her mother at night, listening to stories about strong, brave women who overcame impossible odds. Racheal believed her mother was one of them. And Syntoria was determined to prove her right. That's why she moved to Willow Pines Apartments, a quiet complex just outside Atlanta. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and most importantly, it felt safe. After everything they had been through, Syntoria wanted a fresh start. A place where she and Racheal could breathe. A place where no one would ever hurt them again. But she never could have imagined that the real danger wasn't the past she had left behind, it was already waiting for her, disguised as a friendly smile. 52-year-old Ernie McDowell had been the apartment manager at Willow Pines for years. To most, he was just the handyman, the man who fixed leaky faucets and broken locks, who greeted tenants with a nod and a polite, fatherly charm. A devoted husband, a father of 2 teenage boys, a respected figure in the neighborhood. From the very first day at Willow Pines, Syntoria noticed him. He was always around, always watching. At first, she brushed it off: he was just doing his job, checking on tenants, making small talk. But something about him made her uneasy. There was a weight in his stare, something unspoken in the way he lingered just a little too long. To most people, he was just a regular guy, a little too friendly at times, but harmless. The kind of man who smiled at neighbors, waved at kids, and always had a joke ready. But there were whispers. Women in the complex spoke in hushed voices about his behavior. How he always seemed to take a special interest in married women, especially single mothers. How he offered favors that came with unspoken conditions. Syntoria wanted no part of it. She had fought too hard to escape one man's control, she wasn't about to fall into another trap. From the beginning, she kept her distance, polite but firm. She refused his offers to help, turned down his unnecessary kindness. She made it clear she wasn't interested, and that was a mistake, because Ernie McDowell was not a man who handled rejection well. To the outside world, Ernie was just a helpful landlord. A devoted husband. A harmless man. But Syntoria knew better. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was just how far Ernie McDowell was willing to go to make sure that if he couldn't have her, no one could. Ernest McDowell was the kind of man who thrived on control. He had spent years perfecting the art of deception, playing the part of a devoted husband, a hardworking father, or respected landlord. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, Ernie was something else entirely. For years, he had used his position at Willow Pines Apartments to target women, single mothers, struggling tenants, women who didn't have the time or resources to fight back. He would offer favors, small at first, fixing a leaky sink, replacing an old appliance, always with the expectation that his kindness would be repaid. And when it wasn't, when the women made it clear they weren't interested in him, he made their lives a living hell. A broken air conditioner that took weeks to fix. A sudden rent increase with no explanation. Whispered rumors about late payments and bad behavior, spreading like wildfire through the complex. Ernie knew exactly how to make life difficult for those who rejected him. And worst of all, no one ever questioned him. His wife and sons had no idea who he really was. Or maybe they did, but they chose to ignore it. After all, Ernie was a provider. A man of the house. A husband who came home every night with a steady paycheck. As long as the bills were paid, no one asked questions. No one looked too closely. And when Syntoria moved in, from the moment he laid eyes on her, he knew she was going to be a problem. A beautiful, strong-willed woman. A single mother, independent, confident. The kind of woman who didn't need a man's help. The kind who wouldn't fall for his usual tricks. And that only made him want her more. At first, he tried to be charming. He would find excuses to linger outside her apartment, waiting for a moment to offer his assistance. Need a hand with those groceries? I can take care of that leaky faucet for you. But Syntoria wasn't interested. She was polite, always, but distant. A closed door. And for a man like Ernie, there was nothing more infuriating than a woman who wouldn't open the door. So he pushed harder. His compliments became more suggestive. His presence more persistent. He started showing up at her apartment unannounced, finding excuses to knock on her door. When she rejected his advances, his demeanor changed. The friendly smile faded. The polite tone grew sharp. And then came the retaliation. Requests for maintenance were suddenly ignored. The hot water went out for 2 days. A noise complaint was filed against her, one she never made. Syntoria knew what was happening. She had dealt with men like him before. But she refused to be intimidated. And that only made him angrier. Then came the night that changed everything. 3 days before the murder, Racheal was in the shower, singing to herself as steam filled the small bathroom. Syntoria was in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner, exhausted from a long day at work. She had no idea that just beyond her front door, Ernie McDowell was standing in the hallway, key in hand. A master key. The one that gave him access to every apartment in the building. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Syntoria froze. A chill ran down her spine before she even turned around. She knew, before she even saw him, she knew. And there he was. Standing in her apartment like he belonged there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant rush of water from the bathroom. Racheal. Her daughter was just feet away, completely unaware. What the hell are you doing? Syntoria's voice was sharp, furious. Ernie just smiled. I thought you said there was a problem with the pipes, he said smoothly, as if nothing was wrong. Her blood ran cold. She had never mentioned any issue with the pipes. Get out, she snapped, her hands shaking with rage. He didn't move. Just stood there, watching her. Now, Syntoria, he said, his voice low. No need to be rude. I was just trying to help. She could barely breathe. Her mind raced, thinking of Racheal, of how quickly she needed to get him out. If you don't get out of my apartment right now, I will call the police. Something in his expression flickered, just for a second. He took a slow step back, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. Relax, he muttered. You don't have to be dramatic. And then he was gone. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, Syntoria locked it, her hands still shaking. She rushed to the bathroom, threw the door open, and found Racheal still singing, still blissfully unaware of what had just happened. But Syntoria knew. She knew this wasn't over. The next day, she did something no other woman had dared to do, she confronted him. In front of tenants, in front of his workers. She didn't hold back. She called him out, made sure everyone knew what kind of man he was. For the first time, Ernie McDowell wasn't the one in control. And he hated her for it. As she stormed off, his face burned red with rage, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Syntoria had humiliated him. And for that, she was going to pay. It was 3 nights later when Ernie McDowell decided he wasn't going to be ignored anymore. The anger had been festering inside him, growing hotter with each passing hour. He had always been in control, always had his way. Women feared him. Respected him. Knew better than to cross him. But Syntoria? She had humiliated him. She had made him look weak. And now, she was going to learn what happened to women who didn't know their place. He knocked on her door, his expression calm, his voice steady. "Maintenance check," he said. "Got a report about a leak in the unit below you. Need to take a look." Syntoria hesitated. She knew he was lying, there was no leak. But she was exhausted. The past few days had been draining, and the last thing she wanted was another confrontation. Maybe if she let him check quickly, he'd leave. So she unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, she saw it in his eyes. The shift. The mask slipping. Before she could react, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Been avoiding me," he murmured, his tone low and dangerous. "That's not very nice, Syntoria." Her stomach twisted. "If you don't get out of my apartment right now, I'm calling the police." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're real pretty when you act all tough. But we both know you're not gonna do that." She grabbed her phone from the table, her hands shaking as she started dialing. But before she could hit send, Ernie snatched it away and slammed it to the ground, shattering the screen. Now that, he growled, was a mistake. Syntoria's heart pounded. This was it. The moment she had feared. The moment she had prayed would never come. She took a step back, fire flashing in her eyes. "You think I won't tell people what you've been doing?" she spat. "You think I won't expose you? I'll go to the police, the apartment complex, and I'll put your face all over social media. Every woman in this city is gonna know exactly what kind of sick bastard you are. You won't be able to hide." And that was when he snapped. The back of his hand struck her across the face with enough force to send her stumbling into the wall. Racheal's scream cut through the air, a tiny, terrified wail that made the hairs on Ernie's arms stand on end. "Mama!" Syntoria recovered quickly, her mother's instinct kicking in. She lunged at him, her nails raking across his face, drawing blood. He roared in pain, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her against the wall so hard the drywall cracked. "You really thought you could talk to me like that?" he hissed. "Make a fool out of me?" She clawed at his grip, struggling, gasping, fighting for breath. And then he let go. For a split second, she thought he was stopping. That maybe he'd come to his senses. But then she saw him reach into his tool bag. The wrench gleamed under the dim light. She didn't even have time to scream. The first hit split her forehead open, blood spraying across the beige carpet. The second caved in her temple. The third silenced her forever. Racheal sobbed, curled in the corner, her tiny hands covering her eyes as if that could make it all go away. "Mama," she whimpered. "Mama, wake up." Ernie turned to the child, chest heaving, blood splattered across his uniform. He knew he couldn't leave her alive. She had seen everything. He crouched down in front of her, his hands slick with her mother's blood. "Shoo, baby girl," he cooed, reaching for her. "It's okay now." But Racheal knew better. She screamed and tried to run, but he grabbed her by her braids, yanking her back so hard that she fell onto the floor. She kicked, scratched, her tiny fists pounding against his arms, but it was useless. His hands closed around her throat. She gasped, choked, her fingers clawing at his grip. Her little legs jerked, her sneakers scraping against the carpet. But he didn't stop. He squeezed harder, harder, until her struggles grew weaker. Until her body finally went limp. When it was over, he let go, letting her lifeless form drop onto the couch. She looked like a broken doll, her wide, unblinking eyes still full of tears. Ernie wiped the sweat from his forehead, stepping back to admire his work. Syntoria had learned her lesson. And the kid? She was just collateral damage. Now, he just had to clean up the mess. Ernie stood in the middle of the blood-soaked apartment, his chest rising and falling in heavy, panicked breaths. The reality of what he had done was sinking in, pressing down on him like a crushing weight. Syntoria Caldwell was dead. Her little girl, Racheal, was dead. And there was no undoing it. He needed to think. Fast. His hands trembled as he reached for the roll of industrial trash bags from his maintenance kit. The same ones he used for hauling out old carpeting and broken fixtures, now, they'd be used for something far worse. He forced Syntoria's body into one, the plastic stretching tight around her lifeless form. The blood made it difficult, her limbs were slippery, uncooperative. Frustrated, he yanked the bag up higher, tying it off with shaking fingers. Then he turned to Racheal. She was so small. So light. For the first time, something flickered in his chest, something like regret. But it passed just as quickly as it came. He had no time for second thoughts. He shoved her body into another bag, twisting it shut before loading them both into the maintenance cart. The hallways were quiet as he wheeled the cart toward the service elevator. It was late, most of the tenants were asleep, and those who weren't had long since learned to mind their own business. Ding! The elevator doors slid open. He stepped inside, jabbing the button for the basement. The ride down felt like an eternity. The hum of the machinery. The faint creak of the old metal frame. The heavy weight of what he was about to do. The basement was dark, damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and dust. But that wasn't the smell that would soon fill the space. Ernie rolled the cart to the back of the room, where an old incinerator sat unused in the corner. Most people didn't even know it was still functional. He had made sure of that. He had used it before. He reached for the gas can, his fingers curling around the handle. This was it. He would burn them, erase the evidence, and by the time anyone even realized they were missing, there would be nothing left to find. But what he didn't know, what he never could have predicted, was that someone was watching. 64-year-old Elijah Rollins had lived in Willow Pines apartments for over 2 decades. A retired factory worker with a bad hip and a sharper mind than most gave him credit for. And he had always had a feeling about Ernie. A feeling that told him the man wasn't right. That night, when Elijah heard the service elevator rumbling in the dead of night, something told him to check. When he cracked open the basement door, staying hidden in the shadows, he saw it all. The cart. The trash bags. The gasoline. And the moment Ernie struck a match. Elijah didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. By the time the police arrived, the scent of burning flesh was already filling the basement. The heat from the incinerator was searing, the flames licking hungrily at the blackened plastic. Officers stormed in, guns drawn, their shouts bouncing off the concrete walls. Hands up. Step away. Ernie turned, his face streaked with soot and sweat, his hands still clutching the gas can. This ain't what it looks like, he stammered. But it was exactly what it looked like. The fire was extinguished, but it was too late. Syntoria and Racheal were already partially burned. Yet even in death, they still held the truth. The bruises on Syntoria's throat. The gash on her forehead. The wrench, still stained with blood. And Racheal, sweet, innocent Racheal, had fought harder than he ever expected. Her tiny fingerprints were embedded in his skin, her final act of defiance captured in the crescent-shaped nail marks on his arms. The evidence was undeniable. Ernie McDowell was out of time. News of the murders spread like wildfire. By the time the sun rose over Atlanta, Ernie McDowell's face was plastered across every television screen, every news site, every social media feed. The friendly apartment manager, the so-called family man, was now exposed as a predator and a killer. When police led him out of Willow Pines in handcuffs, his face was streaked with soot, his uniform stained with the blood of the woman and child he had brutally murdered. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as they shouted questions he refused to answer. "Why did you do it, Ernie? Did you really think you'd get away with it? What do you have to say to Syntoria's family?" But Ernie kept his head down, his jaw clenched, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. The same tenants he once bullied and manipulated now stood on their balconies, watching in stunned silence, whispering among themselves. Some were crying. Others were shaking their heads, trying to process how the man they had trusted to keep their homes safe had turned into the very monster they feared. At the police station, the charges came swiftly and without hesitation. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Aggravated assault. Attempted destruction of evidence. The district attorney made it clear, there would be no plea deals, no negotiations. They would seek the maximum sentence. Meanwhile, Ernie's wife, Sheila McDowell, sat in their quiet suburban home, staring at the television in disbelief. The man she had been married to for nearly 25 years, the father of her 2 sons, was now being labeled a murderer. She watched the footage of his arrest, her hands trembling as her teenage boys sat beside her, eyes wide with shock. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered, though deep down, she wasn't sure if she believed it. As more details emerged, the city erupted in outrage. How had this man been allowed to terrorize women for so long? Former tenants came forward with their own horror stories, stories of harassment, threats, and intimidation. They spoke about the times they had complained, the times they had been ignored, the times they had been forced to move rather than deal with his advances. Social media was relentless. People demanded justice for Syntoria and Racheal. Some questioned how many others had suffered in silence, how many lives had been disrupted by a man who abused his position of power. The conversation quickly turned to the broader issue, tenant protection laws, or the lack thereof. Why had no one stopped him before? Why did so many landlords and property managers wield unchecked control over the vulnerable? Hashtags like #Justice for Syntoria and Racheal and #Stop Predators in Power trended for weeks. Some called for new regulations, stricter background checks for property managers. Others simply mourned, unable to comprehend the sheer cruelty of it all. And in the midst of it, one heartbreaking truth remained. An innocent mother and her child had been taken in the most brutal way possible. And no amount of outrage or debate could bring them back. The trial of Ernie McDowell was one of the most watched in Atlanta's history. People packed the courtroom, eager to see justice served. Reporters lined the hallways, cameras rolling as Ernie was led inside, shackled, expressionless. The once confident apartment manager now looked small, stripped of the authority he had used to control and terrorize. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted him as a calculated predator, a man who used his power to exploit, manipulate, and ultimately destroy the lives of those who stood up to him. They called witnesses, former tenants who testified about the times Ernie had harassed them, delayed their maintenance requests when they rejected him, made their lives miserable simply because he could. But the most damning testimony came from Syntoria's closest friends and neighbors. They spoke about how she had feared Ernie, how she had tried to avoid him, how she had vowed to expose him. They recalled the night she had confronted him, the fury in his eyes, the way he had stormed off. They knew, even then, that something wasn't right. And then, there was the evidence, the security footage showing Ernie forcing his way into Syntoria's apartment, the wrench he had used to bash her skull in, the defensive wounds on Racheal's tiny hands. But nothing was more haunting than the images of Ernie's arms, still marked with the fingerprints of an 8-year-old girl who had fought with everything she had to survive. The defense tried to argue that Ernie had acted in the heat of the moment, that he hadn't planned to kill anyone. They painted him as a man who had simply snapped under the weight of rejection and humiliation. But the jury saw through it. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of control. Ernie had made sure Syntoria paid for standing up to him, and he had taken the life of an innocent child to cover his tracks. It took less than 3 hours for the jury to reach a verdict. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, all eyes fixed on Ernie. Guilty. On all counts. Ernie showed no emotion. No remorse. No regret. Only the same cold, empty stare he had carried since the day of his arrest. At sentencing, the judge made it clear, this crime was beyond redemption. A mother and child had been brutally murdered in their own home, and for what? Because a man couldn't handle rejection? There was only one punishment severe enough. Death. By lethal injection. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Some sighed in relief. Others wept for Syntoria and Racheal, for the lives that had been stolen in such a senseless act of violence. Ernie remained emotionless as the judge delivered his fate. But when asked if he had any final words before being taken away, he finally spoke. His voice was low, but his words echoed through the courtroom, chilling everyone to the bone. She should have just shut up. Gasps filled the room. Syntoria's friends and family shook with anger, some shouting at him, others breaking down in tears. Even the judge looked momentarily stunned by his callousness. But in that moment, everyone saw him for what he truly was. Not a man consumed by rage. Not a man who had simply snapped. A monster. One who had finally faced the consequences of his own evil. This case serves as a haunting reminder that danger isn't always found in dark alleys or shadowy figures, it often hides in plain sight, disguised as someone trustworthy, someone familiar. Syntoria Caldwell did everything right. She worked hard, she fought for a better future for her daughter, and she refused to let a predator intimidate her. But in the end, it wasn't enough to save her or Racheal from the monster living right next door. It's a terrifying reality. How many other women have been trapped in situations like this, feeling powerless against men who use their authority as a weapon? How many warnings go ignored before tragedy strikes? Could Ernie McDowell have been stopped before it was too late? And more importantly, what can be done to protect women and children from predators who exploit their positions to prey on the vulnerable? Let's continue this conversation in the comments below. What do you think could have been done differently? Should there be stricter protections in place for tenants dealing with harassment from landlords and property managers? And if this story disturbed you as much as it did us, make sure to like this video and subscribe. We bring you real-life cases of horror, betrayal, and justice, because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened.